Good evening, everybody. Good evening, good evening. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director of Popular Conservatism, or PopCon as it's more commonly known. Thanks for joining us. I know many of you will have been out pounding the streets and wearing out shoe leather. When we set up this event, we weren't expecting a general election on July the 4th, but you know, what a surprise. And I know that will make many of you busy, but I'm absolutely delighted that our guest today has still been able to find an hour in his busy diary. I'll introduce him shortly, but let me, as you're taking your seats, just go through a few of the sort of protocols and how these things work. Those of you who have joined us on Pop Conversations before will know this, but bear with me. First thing to say is I want to take as many questions from you guys as possible. So if you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen on Zoom. Don't put it in the chat box, in the Q&A box, and I'll try to get through as many of your questions as possible. If you don't ask a question, or even if you do, you can decide which questions you want me to put, and you can give a thumbs up to move them up the list. And given I'm such a democratic sort of guy, I'm likely to pick those that are towards the high end of the list. So give me a nudge on which sort of questions you'd like me to put. Just a reminder that this is being recorded. If you want to reuse any part of it for your own ends, do get in touch with PopCon before doing so. The copyright is ours. And also to remind you, we might dot 2 or 3 polls in just to ask the audience what they think of things on a range of topics. So they will spring up on your screen. They're anonymized, so you can click on whatever answer you want just to get a feel of what popular conservatives are thinking at the moment. So that's all it from me. Oh yeah, I can just see one coming up at the moment. You can use the emoji button, the react button at the bottom of the screen to show your heart filling with joy, or a round of applause, or champagne, and all of the rest of it, depending on what you think either I or Ben have said. So thanks again for joining us, for all those in the audience, and a big warm welcome to Ben Houchen, Lord Houchen, the Mayor of Tees Valley, first elected in May 2017, narrowly won then. I think a lot of people, Ben, thought you'd only have one term, so you might as well get on with it. Then you were re-elected in a kind of North Korean-style landslide with a preposterous share of the vote. And then in very difficult circumstances, just earlier this month, you pulled off a fantastic re-election to secure your 3rd term. So thanks very much for joining us. How's it looking up there, Ben?
Well, obviously I was re-elected 3 weeks ago, so it feels pretty good to me. No, it was nice to be re-elected, and it was quite a stressful time, obviously, with everything that's going on across the country, but actually it wasn't that close in the end. And what's interesting is, with them calling the general election for the 4th of July, obviously a lot of the local Conservative MPs have jumped straight from supporting me in the mayoral election to right into the general election, and the mood is pretty positive. I don't know whether there's a bit of a microcosm happening in Teesside at the minute, because obviously with my election 3 weeks ago, there's a strong campaign locally to talk about the fact, well, if you've re-elected Ben as the mayor, you know, the team that's helped him deliver what he's delivered over the last 5, 6, 7 years, why wouldn't you keep that team together to keep the show on the road? I mean, that's very simplistic terms, but a lot of credit does need to go to some of the local MPs like Simon Clark, Jacob Young, Peter Gibson, Matt Vickers, who have helped me extensively. So I think there is going to, hopefully, touch wood, be some rub off from the mayoral election a few weeks ago. But it's interesting, you know, out in the doors, speaking to people, the VIs that are coming back are actually pretty positive. Certainly much better than the national picture in the media would have you believe. So it's interesting. It still seems to me like all of those seats are to play for, which again, if you take the national polls, would suggest that they were far too far gone for us to even compete in. But that's absolutely not the case. And I'd be surprised if we didn't win at least a few of those. Actually, I don't think we're hanging on to, you know, Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland has the biggest majority, Simon Clark. You know, I don't think we're in a place where the national polls would suggest we're just hanging on to Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland, or trying to hang on to it. Actually, there's a huge amount of headroom to make way in places like the new Stockton West seat with Matt Vickers. Darlington's very, very positive. And I do think that places like Redcar, given the amount of attention, investment and focus that it's had, is all to play for. So no, I don't know what it's feeling like elsewhere, but it feels like there's a hell of a fight in our hands locally, but one that we feel like we can win.
So we'll come back to issues and prospects around the general election shortly. But share with us, what the hell has been the secret of your success, Ben? Most people would not say that Tees Valley is, obvious true blue territory, but you've now been elected for a third term. How have you done it? What's happened in Tees Valley around your candidature and support for the Conservative Party? That, I mean, I think you won't mind me saying that you were a bit of a long shot in 2017, bit of a dark horse, and have now won both in good times for the Conservatives and challenging times earlier this month. What do you put that down to? I mean, share with the councillors and canvassers on this call what the secret ingredient is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know you like a bit of a flutter, Mark. So I don't know whether you remember this from 2017, but when I was first selected as the candidate in December of 2016, so just over 5 months before the election, I was 250 to 1 to win the election just 5 months later. And what's arguably more interesting than that, the day of the election, on polling day, or actually the day of the count, which was the day after the election, I was still 20 to 1 to win the election on that day. And to be frank, lots of things came together. It's typical politics, right? It's about having the right plan. It's about good timing. Politics is often about good luck and good timing. And a lot of things came together. So, for example, my mayoral election in 2017 was 4 or 5 weeks before the general election that Theresa May called. So it was before the manifesto. It was before all the nonsense that caused all sorts of havoc there. We were 20, 25 points ahead in the polls, which helped in a place like Teesside that was solid red since the Second World War. And we made some pretty eye-catching pledges around trying to save the local airport from closure that came together as a perfect storm and meant that we crept over the line with just over 1,000 vote majority on 500,000 votes. So it was very, very close as a result. So we got quite lucky. Like I say, right plan, things came together for us. But the thing that's changed fortunes for the long term was, I mean, in very short descriptions, it was delivery. So when I was first elected, the big thing was the airport. Still is. People still talk about me in Teesside Airport. It's something I'm sure I'll be forever associated with. But we did a lot of really interesting and good things locally for the first 18 months when I was elected in 2017. We were starting to build a plan. We were looking much longer term for what we wanted to regenerate the region. But it didn't matter what we did. Any journalist, anybody in the local community would come out and say, "That's great, Ben, but have you saved the airport yet?" And the thing that changed everything was when we actually managed to save the airport, because it gave us a level of credibility that very few politicians, sadly, in this day and age have. And it was also such a big pledge that people didn't think I was going to deliver, that when we delivered it, it gave us a huge amount of goodwill with the public, that these longer term plans that we've been setting out now for the last 7 years that are starting to come to fruition, it gave the public a reason to give us that goodwill for the longer term because we delivered in the short term. And we basically leveraged that. So once we saved the airport, we don't overpromise. We only promise things that we're going to be able to deliver, and we deliver on them. And it sounds really simple, but sadly in politics, there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of, oh, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And with the mayoral role not being about necessarily public policy, but about large-scale infrastructure, jobs, investment, transport, you can be very clear on what you're wanting to do. And the material output of that is for all to see. In that, I now can stand here, as I did in my election 3 weeks ago, and say, you don't have to believe what I say. You can go and see it for yourself. Go and see the stations being rebuilt. Go and speak to the people down the pub who now have jobs that weren't there before. And it creates a momentum in and of itself. So, I've always been a big believer, having grown up in a family that wasn't particularly political. There's a lot of hot air in politics. And if you just do what you say you're going to do, even if it's not promising the earth, that goes a long way with the electorate. So
let me just, especially with my Institute of Economic Affairs antecedents in mind, Ben, challenge you on really whether should Conservative politicians go around saving things? Why did the airport need to be saved?
I mean, I would argue. So, I think a few years ago, Mark, you challenged me on this when I think we were in a meeting in London, and the answer's still the same. So, my argument isn't that there was an intervention there by Conservative politicians to do something that people would naturally think is unconservative. I would say that the market failure actually occurred when the local authorities, in effect, owned the airport and sold it off without the requisite protections in place. And I do believe that there are things that we require as a country. We're talking about airports, but you could arguably apply it to other key pieces of infrastructure that are essential to create the environment for the private sector to thrive. And if you have an area like Teesside that has been neglected for many, many decades, particularly where the public sector and governments are investing in our major cities, of which Teesside is not a major city, it's an agglomeration of small to medium-sized towns, then it's creating an increasingly uneven playing field. And as a regional mayor, losing an airport when I'm trying to attract a private investment as the mayor, which is what we've done, is going to be really impossible, because I can't go to the Americans, the Koreans, I can't go to investors in the UK or Europe and say, come and invest in Teesside, but forget the fact that the local airport just closed. And if you want to get to us, you know what, you've got to fly into Manchester and airport and try and get across the M62 or get on a crappy pacer train for 2.5 hours, assuming one turns up. That is not an area that's connected. And that is not an area that investors who are looking for certainty for investment are going to spend their time coming to. And this is because we're competing with the likes of Manchester, Birmingham, London, and elsewhere. We have to have those key pieces of infrastructure to enable the private sector to thrive. Now, ideally, we shouldn't have had to have intervened, but because of the lack of protections that were put in place by the local authorities, the short-termism of the local authorities when they sold off the airport, and again, when they sold it, they retained a significant stake, but were then not doing what they should do as shareholders, which is protect their own interests, and were just kind of going with the flow with the private investor. You know what? Adam Smith in in a lot of his literature talked about the fact that the private sector is not a perfect market, and monopolies will form. People will not necessarily do the best for everybody, but they'll do the best for their own interests. The public sector failed to protect a piece of asset there, and so I believe we're trying to correct a market failure caused by the local authorities when they sold it off without the right protections, and actually to the wrong partner without the right plan in place.
Let me ask you something else about Tees Valley, that sort of area. How much do you think the Brexit effect is sort of unwinding now? I mean, when it came to the referendum, obviously the Conservative Party was divided. Cabinet ministers were allowed to campaign on either side. But areas of the country, a long way from where I live in London, took a very firm leave view, which then seemed to put the Conservative Party in pretty good stead for years to come. The Labour Party and others, most mainstream parties were associated with Remain, and at least a big wing of the Conservative Party, including Boris Johnson, was associated with Leave. And that seemed to bring with it a kind of new wells of support in different parts of the country, reflected, of course, in a pretty spectacular 2019 general election result and the majority of 80 to get Brexit done. Do you think that's a permanent feature of people's voting behaviour, or was that a one-off around the EU issue and now we're reverting back to sort of traditional voting patterns, or has that brought people over to the Conservative cause who may now stick with the Conservative cause in perpetuity?
I think what it is it's absolutely not a reversion back to traditional party lines. And we're seeing this in the general election. I think we saw it locally in Teesside in my election. What Brexit did and what the general election in 2019 did is it broke those party lines, whereas now people might not vote Conservative at this election or in the next election, but what they are now is open to it, whereas 10 years ago they weren't.
They would have just been typically voting Labour because they always have and their parents always have and so on.
And they would never think about it. They would never even contemplate voting Conservative. But again, if you get into the detail of it, Teesside has been going less Labour, and it has gone less Labour in every single election, local, national, and European, since 1997. And that's linked to something much more complicated. It's about the decline of paternalistic industries, unionised industries, complete change of economies. I'm 37. With the greatest respect to the great woman, I don't remember anything about Margaret Thatcher. So, if you're under the age of 40, 45, it's interesting and can inform lessons, but it's not of your era. It's not something you live through, and it's something you hear your parents or your grandparents talk about now. So there's a break from what happened in particularly places in the Northeast around mining and steel making in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s that doesn't resonate with my age group and below anymore. And you also have this fact that kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about my election. There's a huge disaffection in Teesside from having been neglected for so long. And that's kind of put at the feet of established parties, Westminster politics. It just feels very, very remote. And the reason the general election in 2019 went the way that it did, particularly in Teesside, was because Boris delivered exactly what the people wanted. Mm-hmm. That's ultimately what it came down to. If you look at places like Redcar voted near just over 67% to leave. And it had the biggest swing of the general election in 2019 by, I think, 21 points. I mean, that didn't happen by accident. It happened not in and of itself just because of Brexit. it was tied up in people's disaffection with traditional politics, the way that it doesn't work for them, and also this kind of upstart, not typical politician who had prorogued Parliament and wasn't interested in what the Supreme Court had to say and was just trying to deliver the will of the people, which is the voice that these people hadn't felt like they'd been listened to for a long, long time. That's why they re-elected him or elected him as the Prime Minister in 2019, because he did what he said he would do and he listened to what they wanted. So you can have all of the commentary around the complexities of Brexit, but when you break it down, it came down to people not being listened to, feeling like Brexit was a foghorn and a way in which for people to vent decades of neglect and being ignored, coupled with a charismatic leader who actually did what the country wanted him to do, and he delivered on that promise. All of that came together for what that was, that seismic result. And just to very quickly touch on one of the points you made, Mark, I don't necessarily think it's an unwinding. I think there is still, particularly on Brexit, I think there are still very strong views. There are still very strong views in places like Teesside on Brexit, and you can get into the detail of what hasn't happened. I think that's one of the things that people might reflect on after the general election, which is we voted for Brexit, but have we delivered what we promised the people from Brexit? And again, it goes back to this point of, well, you delivered Brexit and you said as a result of Brexit, this is going to happen. So Boris, you've done the first bit, you've delivered Brexit, we're going to re-elect you in 2019. Now it's to deliver on the promise of Brexit. And I think it's fair to say, I personally, as a Brexiteer, don't think we've delivered as much as we could do on the promise of Brexit.
That's interesting. I want to come down to a kind of overview of where the nation is shortly. But what are your thoughts on the general election campaign so far, Ben? I mean, it wasn't the most auspicious start, was it? I mean, Rishi Sunak ruining, no doubt, a very expensive suit in the pouring rain, while Steve Bray plays "Things Can Only Get Better" over a massive loudspeaker just down the road, and then visiting the Titanic quarter in Belfast. A bit of a wobbly start, wouldn't you say?
I mean, I always try and separate out the two things. I mean, if you sit on Twitter and you listen to the commentariat, then those are the things that have been talked about for the last 3 or 4 days. When I speak to people in my community, I speak to friends and family who sadly I don't get to see as much as I would like to. The one thing that they've talked to me a lot about, and actually these are arguments on both sides of it, is Rishi's promise on national service. My mother, for instance, thinks it's a terrible idea. My father thinks it's a great idea. It's interesting how it's dividing opinion, but it's the one thing that people are talking about. I don't know anybody, I've never been spoken to in the street about the fact that Rishi visited Northern Ireland and the Titanic Museum because some commentariat wanted to make a sinking ship. I mean, a lot of that for me doesn't really cut through, and I think what I'm seeing so far in the general election is there isn't a huge amount of cut through on either side, with the exception of, like I say, voices on either side of the argument about the national service stuff. But for me, it all feels a little bit like it's a skirmish before the war. I mean, we need to get into, what is Rishi promising as part of the manifesto around the economy? What are we going to do to get people in jobs? What are we doing about growth? What are we doing about trying to unpick a lot of the stagnation that we've seen in the country around overregulation? I mean, we could go on for hours about that, Mark, and I'm sure you'll want to touch upon it a little bit as well. And the other side of that coin, which I think is utterly bizarre, is just how little scrutiny, even now the election is being called, that the Labour Party is still getting. I mean, I always thought that when the general election got called, all of a sudden the media would start to do what they always do in general elections, which is try and rip apart every single party, scrutinise them and let the public decide. And all I'm seeing is a group of media following Keir Starmer around as if it's some sort of fan group. And he says, well, we're going to go for growth. Well, that's great, but how are you going to do that? What are you going to do to do that? And how are you going to make it stack up, given that you're not cutting taxes, you're not raising taxes, you're going to spend all this money on public services? And they just say, oh, you're going to go for growth. That's great. Oh, we're going to stop the boats. How are you going to stop the boats? We're going to go after the gangs. Okay, well, what does that mean? And how does that actually make any... They're not asking the questions that a responsible media, I think, should be asking, particularly in what I think is an essential general election campaign, where the country needs a boost. We need to move forward. We need to break through what feels like a difficult few months where people all feel a little bit down, a little bit depressed. We want to move forward to a brighter future, which this country absolutely has.
Now, you mentioned the national service pledge, Ben. I've got to admit, I'm a little bit of a skeptic about it. You said your mother was against, or your father was in favour, or whatever.
Yeah.
What's your stance on it? I mean, my sort of starting point is I think that Conservatives sort of generally want the state to get out of people's way. and not oblige citizens to have to pay huge tax or to work for the government. They think the government should work for the people. And I think we just popped up a poll now to ask people on the chat, do you agree with the proposal to bring back national service? I mean, it's of a very different type. We say bring back national service, it's of a different type. I mean, I think I'd be more attracted to it if it was for people who were otherwise reliant on the state, for example. You know, right, I'm claiming housing benefit and welfare and I can't get a job. Okay, well, you can go and do this. But do you think it should be an obligation for all citizens aged 18?
Yeah, I think what's interesting in the way that it's been portrayed is as some sort, you say, national service, you know, you're going to go into the army, you're going to go and fight a war. I mean, that's demonstrably not what this is. And actually, it's been tried and tested, not just in Scandinavia. I mean, my wife lived in Germany for a couple of years, spent a lot of time over there, and they have the exact same thing, where you can go and do your military service or you can go and do kind of voluntary service as well. I mean, the reason my father was for it is because he was in the army for a lot of years, and my mother's against it because, again, more of that, well, you shouldn't really be dictating to people what they should be doing. There are a group of people, I mean, what Rishi's trying to get across is there are a group of young people who are disaffected in the education system. They often come from broken socioeconomic backgrounds who have been failed by public bodies, state services, often in their own neighborhoods, their communities are fractured. And it's trying to go back to this time of giving them a level of structure and opportunity that currently that they are not afforded in the communities that they're in. And it's been extrapolated to that to be a national scheme. And again, if you were to speak to some members in my family, they say, well, hang on, why, if I'm 18 and I want to go off to university, does that mean I have to step out of university for a year? And it requires a bit of fleshing out. I mean, like I say, I think it's a skirmish before the war. I don't think it's the main thing. I don't think it's the thing that's going to decide how the general election is won in any way, shape, or form. I think ultimately that comes down to the economy. And that's why I feel like there are lots of these miniature skirmishes. And at some point, hopefully there's going to be this big reveal from Rishi about what a Rishi Sunak Conservative government is going to be about, with a clear mandate and a clear 4 or 5 years in government. And that's going to come back to how it hits people in the pocket. So what are you going to do about taxation? What are you going to do about growing the economy? What are you going to do about housing? All of those things. That's what's going to move votes. And you can, I think, kind of see that in the polls, that there's not much really happening, with the exception of 1 or 2 polls that are suggesting something is happening. And we need to get onto it, because snap elections are short and people need to know. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult for us to be able to mount a strong campaign going into polling day.
John Wright asks, and you touched on this a little bit there, Ben. John Wright, I think, is a Conservative councillor from Derby, if I recall correctly. What needs to be done as a matter of urgency to narrow the polls? I mean, you can believe whichever pollster you want. There is one poll out today suggesting that the Labour lead over the Conservatives is 12%, which is relatively narrow compared to others. But what do you think needs to be done? Because we're in this strange position at the moment, Ben, where parties are sort of rolling out policy pledges, but it could well be another, I don't know, 10 days before we actually see the party manifestos, right?
Yeah. And this is all part of the internal strategies of both parties, I imagine, about, you know, it's a bit like the element of surprise of Rishi calling the election. Does that create an advantage by holding on until the release of the manifesto, create a big bang that sees a movement of the dial? Or actually, do you want this drip feed and this drumbeat of releases that starts to build up a picture and a momentum? Now, what's interesting that I can kind of see from both is that there doesn't seem to be this drumbeat of day in, day out, here's another policy. We're not kind of really drip feeding manifestos on either side. But I think everybody is crying out for a bit more substance on the economy. I mean, when nobody's talking really about the economy. I mean, Rachel Reeves said a little bit the other day about not raising any more taxes, but wasn't, again, challenged or very specific on what that actually meant and what that meant for the economy. And I think that's what people are waiting to see. And I think when we get onto that pitch, and when Rishi and the Conservatives actually set out that platform, and invariably that is going to have to force Labour to be a bit more detailed on whatever their plans are, then I think that will be the substantial move in the polls. And for me, I mean, to directly answer the question, what do we need to do to narrow the polls? Well, we need to show people, one, I know Rishi says, you know, we've got a plan, we absolutely have a plan, but we need to show that relates to people on a personal level. So this plan, how is it going to affect me? Am I going to have more money? Are my wages going to go up? Am I going to be able to get a better job? Are my kids going to be able to get a better job? Are my mortgage rates going to come down? I'm going to be able to borrow money more easily. I mean, these are the things that people actually care about. And that's how you narrow the polls. You've got to come up with a credible plan. And what's interesting, if we come up with a credible plan, it's released quickly, I think the polls will narrow quite significantly, because there is still no love for the Labour Party. There is a lot of distrust about whether you can trust them with the economy and national security, which, to be frank, is why Keir Starmer's over the last couple of days is going so heavily on that, because he knows it's a weak spot. And it kind of feels like if we can get ahead of that and we can land it, then you can define the next 4 or 5 weeks of a campaign and hopefully get us into a position where we're competitive.
So I've got the results from our poll that we flashed up. I have to say this is not a scientific sample, right? There's a number of dozens of popular Conservative supporters rather than reflect a national opinion. But of those on this webinar, 64% agree with the proposal to bring back national service. 22% disagree. 14% say they don't know. Coming up on a bit more to what might be in the manifesto, one of the things I slightly tear my hair out about, Ben, is that you would think, frankly, listening to politicians of all stripes, that there's a sort of vast pot of money to be spread around, and the only argument is how we spread it around and what we focus it on. Whereas we're still running a budget deficit, I think, slightly north of 50 billion. We've added colossally to the national debt, not just because of the COVID crisis, but continually since 2001. Nathan Aquera asks, in your opinion, is the state too big? And if so, what measures should be taken to reduce the size of the state? One theory was that the election was called earlier because there wasn't believed to be the fiscal headroom to actually have some tax cuts at some point in the autumn. But I get a bit despondent when everybody apparently gets incredibly worried about so-called unfunded tax cuts, but not so worried about unfunded public spending.
Yes, and we've seen how that's played out over the last 18 months or so. I mean, my view, absolutely, the state is far too big. And I think where you can save a lot of money, you can deal with a lot of bureaucracy, and you can also help supercharge growth is by people talk about eliminating quangos, but the argument is much more subtle than that. It's not about getting rid of quangos. There are a lot over the last 10 years, largely under the Conservative government, but it started also the back end of the Labour government. There is the creation of, or the expanding powers of, a lot of arm's length bodies from government. And they do that, I think, personally, to try and inoculate themselves from responsibility. You know, if I give this to an arm's length body like the Environment Agency or Homes England or whoever it might be, it's their decision to take. It's not a minister's decision to take. And it's always wrapped up in the guise of independence. But I actually think the opposite is true. I think if you elect a government on a mandate, that government has a mandate to deliver, and actually ministers should be more empowered to be able to make those decisions, to be able to affect that change. And I think what you find is there is a slowness in the system, there is a stasis in the system, there is a quagmire of inactivity that is built up around organizations feeding into each other that actually ultimately have no accountability. And so nothing ever gets done. So whether that's the planning inspectorate, or whether that, like I say, whether that's the Environment Agency, whether it's the Marine Maritime Organization, all of these that I come into contact with, they don't mind whether something takes 6 months, a year, 3, 4 years, frankly. They don't really care, as long as they cover themselves with lots of advice and lots of consultation. And there is actually very little that ministers can do. I mean, I won't go into the detail of this, but a minister once told me about an arm's length body, because I was trying to get them to do something. It would be easier for us to change the law than it would be for me as the Secretary of State to tell the arm's length body what to do.
Now, yeah, well, I mean, you hit, Ben, totally on the kind of the core proposition of PopCon is that the way that we've constructed decision-making bodies in the United Kingdom, all these arm length bodies, quangos, independent experts, and that's fine. Of course, you should listen to experts, but I'm a bit nervous that the term independent is basically interchangeable with unaccountable. So it seems that the OBR writes our budget at least as much as the Chancellor of the Exchequer does. Do you think the Conservatives should pledge, you know, a serious reset of these sort of things? The Labour Party, in contrast, is saying that they'll give the OBR 10 weeks before the Labour Party itself produces the budget. Well, were the Labour Party to win the election, I think Starmer and Reeves should be producing the budget, not Richard Hughes of the OBR.
I mean, exactly right. And again, it's the definition of what you mean by independent. I mean, to some extent, I don't mind having a group of arm's length bodies that are able to provide advice, but ultimately they should not hold the keys to be able to making the decision. But we've got to a stage now where ministers and secretaries of state physically are not able to overrule or make decisions where those decisions lay with arm's length bodies. And those people are appointed largely by civil servants. Okay, let's be honest. Okay, they get ratified by the relevant Secretary of State, but the recruitment processes all go through the civil service. They're all interviewed by civil servants. They're all often, politicians are completely unaware of these people until a Secretary of State gets a report on his or her desk that says, we are recommending this person for approval. Now, I'm not saying there shouldn't be due process, but the way in which we have made decision-making so remote from the democratic process, one actually has a democratic deficit issue around elections and people feeling like they're being listened to, which I think Teesside is a good microcosm of that, and goes to the point of why things have changed so much in Teesside, because over the last 5 years, they have been listened to, and that's made some pretty drastic changes in the way that people approach their voting intentions. But it can go so far to unlocking the growth that we talk about. Because if I'm the Prime Minister who has a mandate to go and build 5 million homes over the next 5 years, and all of a sudden my Secretary of State, who I'm appointing and making accountable to do that, actually has the ability to sign off and pull the lever to be able to make that happen, because actually, you know what, ultimately there might be a recommendation from the planning inspector, but it's actually the Secretary of State's decision that aligns with a mandate that has been given to them by the general public. That seems a much more democratic way of dealing with things. But also we see it in Teesside as well with a lot of what we've done. One of the things that I've been able to do is use the power of the elected mayor to try and drive decisions through as quickly as possible to be able to deliver the outcomes that we've got. And what we actually saw was the Labour Party trying to kind of throw mud and pretend as if we were doing something that we shouldn't be doing. And the electorate said, well, actually, no, we quite like the outcomes that Ben's giving at the minute, so why don't we get on with it? And what you often find is people get so caught up in the process, they lose sight of the outcome. And we could make the state so much smaller, so much more efficient, and still deliver much better outcomes just by rearranging. I mean, you need proper public service reform. I mean, we've been promising it as a Conservative Party since David Cameron in 2010. For whatever reason, it never really transpires. What I think might change things in years to come rather than months to come is the experiment that seems to be going on in Argentina at the moment. And if that does really succeed, which in the early stages looks like it is bearing some fruit, then I think it will give some confidence and boldness to politicians, hopefully elsewhere in the world, including the UK, to follow maybe not the exact same model, but a model that shows that a smaller state can actually reap much bigger benefits.
We can hope to see you wielding a chainsaw on the streets of the Tees Valley, can we, Ben? That would be a fantastic photo. I'd love to see that in campaign literature.
Well, I'm also very fortunate that having been the first mayor, other than the laws that are dictated to me by the UK government, what I tend to find myself doing is batting off new laws rather than having to take chainsaws to existing ones. So local processes, when I was first elected, didn't exist because mayors were brand new. So we've been setting up the institution, and it's been one of the things that I've been cognizant of since I was first elected, is not building a bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake. So what I've been fighting is saying no to processes that I think are completely irrelevant, rather than having, at the moment anyway, to have to take a chainsaw to a whole lot of ineffective processes. But you see it. It's not just national government. You see it with local government. There is just an inertia in the system at the minute where, and I've always believed this, the only way you will ever be able to change it is if you are somehow able to introduce opportunity cost into the public sector. Because the way that the system is set up is that as long as you don't do something wrong, you cannot be held accountable for it. So if nothing happens, then as a civil servant or a local official, I've got a job for life, because nobody can blame me if nothing happens, because there is no account for the loss of opportunity of an investor or something happening in the local community. That's the only way you can ever have real public sector reform. I don't know the answer to that. I'm saying that is the problem, and that's how it needs to be solved. But I don't know what the solution is to that, because it would require some pretty fundamental rewriting of public sector processes.
Well, Valerie Coker, who's a Conservative councillor in Ross-on-Wye, I think it is, she says many people, including me, believe that the civil service are actually controlling everything. How can we stop that? And you touched on that a bit. I'm not expecting this necessarily to be included in the manifesto, but do you think there's a case that we should, if you like, give up the pretense that the civil service are completely neutral servants who just do the ministerial bidding, that they actually come with their own baggage, sometimes their own ideology? One former cabinet minister put to me that the sort of nature of things these days is, if you want to be a public health campaigner, you don't necessarily join a public health campaign. You go and become a civil servant in the Department of Health. If you want to be a green campaigner, you don't necessarily go and work for Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. You go and join the Department of the Environment, and so on and so forth. What do you think? There might be a case that at least the top echelons of the civil service should be direct political appointments, as they are in other countries, like the USA, for example. I think when the US president comes to office, he immediately controls 3,000 appointments. The Prime Minister controls who she or he puts around the cabinet table. What's that, 20 or so? Don't we need to just admit that we want the top brass, the top civil service to be, to be political and following rather than frustrating the stated ambitions of the democratically elected politicians?
I mean, the more I've been in this job, the more I absolutely believe that to be true. And I think what you could end up doing is getting into a place where actually, potentially, in a more optimistic world, you don't necessarily have to reform the large, vast numbers of arm's length bodies. Because let's say if the chief executive / chairman of each of those organizations was a political appointment, then you would know that at least the culture and the people at the top of that organization are there in effect to deliver the democratic mandate of the government of the day. So the system itself would be drawn towards it. Whereas now you have a chief executive of any arm's length body, and that is their job unless they apply for another job, and all they are about self-preservation. So again, if things don't happen and go wrong, they're not going to be dragged in front of a select committee. People, they can keep their heads down and nothing will end up changing. But ultimately, it frustrates growth, it frustrates opportunity, it stops us from delivering the things that we know we can deliver as a country. I personally believe that if we want to see things change quickly without some sort of literal fundamental rewrite of how the UK government works, political appointments are the way to go. And again, I say that on the basis that I've seen some arm's length bodies who are absolutely atrocious, who absolutely have their own agenda, their organizations and boards. Some of their junior officers have their own agenda and actively work against anything remotely prosperous for this country. But I also know that when you find a gem of an arm's length body where you actually have somebody senior who wants to get things done and works within the processes of that organization, but it gets what you're trying to achieve, you can actually do things really quickly. So there is an argument to say, as long as the top echelons of those organizations are pulling in line with the democratic mandate of that government, then fundamental reform, while it would be nice, isn't necessarily essential to at least get the wheels moving. But if it stays as it is, then it doesn't really matter who's in government because nothing will change.
Would you scrap the OBR? I mean, why do we need a state forecaster? There are dozens of forecasters. The OBR's forecasts don't appear to be any better than, in fact, tend to be worse than those that you can source on the private sector. Why don't we just get the Chancellor to look at a range of forecasts before making their decision?
I mean, I think there is a role in that the OBR can be reformed to be able to do just that. The OBR doesn't have to be a body. It could be a body of representative organizations that do better forecasting. I think there's also a more fundamental issue. It goes back to accountability. Who's accountable? Who appoints the OBR? Who's in charge of the OBR? And I'm not saying you politicize the OBR by putting kind of a patsy in there to say whatever you want them to say. But one of the things that frustrates me is it doesn't matter who's in government. The Chancellor will stand up and give a budget or a fiscal statement, and the OBR will invariably give its view on it. And more weight is given to the OBR than it is to the Chancellor. And you and I both know, Mark, and as everybody on this call does as well, it's not as if the Chancellor's sat there by him or herself writing the budget. I mean, this is done by a very extensive Treasury team who are putting this together with their own analysis. But it seems automatically that whatever the Treasury put out through the Chancellor is obviously wrong and the OBR is right. And invariably, there is therefore no backdating to look back at forecasts. And again, we'll have another fiscal event later this year, whoever's in government. The OBR will give its forecast and it will be taken as gospel. When if we actually looked at the last 10 years, the OBR invariably has not just been a little bit wrong, but is usually quite a lot wrong. So something absolutely needs to be done because we saw what's happened over the last couple of years. It's led to some perverse outcomes and it drives the commentariat and it drives the narrative, which you often find if everybody just kind of let the Chancellor's budget kind of play out for 6 months, you'd all of a sudden see that the outcomes are very different to what is projected on budget day, which everybody's running around with media spads trying to frame the argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm right in saying that the OBR's forecasts fiscally tend to be out by an average of just over 50 billion a year. Well, I mean, that's just a colossal margin of error. I'm not sort of blaming them. Economic forecasting is extremely difficult, right? I mean, if you do manage to nail a forecast absolutely bang on, that's going to be as much luck as judgment. But the idea that we're going to have the OBR dictating 50 billion here, 50 billion there, and we think that's their margin of error, seems to me this is a political judgment rather than a matter of economic science.
Yeah, I mean, you can also say that about the fiscal rules that are now imposed on the Treasury, right? I mean, they kind of need to be torn up and be much more realistic, because you can make some pretty ambitious assumptions about what's going to happen, for example, with people on unemployment benefit in 30, 40 years' time. And if you are particularly optimistic about it, it can create billions of pounds worth of headroom for spending today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think there just needs to be more analysis, full stop, about the way we put budgets together, but also about who we're believing and who we're taking as gospel as part of that process. So, I mean, I do get the frustrations with the OBR. I get it all the time, because I look at it and then 6 months later, I always think, well, hang on, the OBR were completely wrong and the Chancellor was actually right. But what we don't have is it all over the BBC News for the next week, which is pointing to the fact that actually what they said 6 months ago is completely wrong. That's a frustration, but I don't think it's as clear cut as saying, oh, we'll just scrap it because it'll be fine. Actually, governments do need to be held to account, because a bit like businesses, politicians will do what's in their own self-interest. And if you allow a chancellor and a treasury team and number 10 to, in effect, adopt its own fiscal rules, those can also lead to perverse outcomes. So it's this whole, I mean, you could arguably strengthen the accountability to Parliament in some way to allow opposition parties to scrutinise more effectively. But again, what we often see with some backbench MPs anyway, is that they're quite happy to outsource it to arm's length bodies, because then all they do is just quote arm's length bodies, but there's no actual analysis by the MPs we're supposed to be paying to hold government to account and Parliament to do its job properly.
David Nob puts in the Q&A more of a statement than a question, but one I agree with. We do not want tinkering and reform of the swamp. We want the quangos and the swamp creatures slashed, budgets cut and taxes cut. If they obstruct government policy, then they should be out of a job. Another area which a number of people are asking questions about, Ben, Cheryl Hennell says, many staunch Conservatives are saying they will not vote Conservative this time because of immigration levels and the lack of action against illegals crossing the channel. Lord Houchen, do you believe that immigration levels can be reduced? I mean, this is, completely enormous in terms of a miss of a manifesto commitment, right? I mean, I think sometimes we make the immigration debate a bit too binary. I mean, some of it's about quantum, but some of it's about type of people who are coming in as well. But is this yet another failure of, even if you've got the political will, you can't kind of get it plugged into the system, that we're going to be frustrated because of, I don't know, the ECHR or the border force. I think the Home Office have lost track of 21,000 people. So even if you wanted to enforce deportations, it's not obvious that you can actually sort of, link things together and make it happen by flicking a switch or pulling a lever. Or, it reminds me of Tony Blair's old observation that when he became Prime Minister, he thought he'd be pulling levers. Turned out he was pushing string. What's your take on the immigration issue? Because this clearly looms large in the public debate, and will do so in voting intentions in this election.
Well, I think immigration is far too high. I think the vast majority of the public believe it's too high. That's not to say that you're against immigration in the same way that the vast majority of the public are pro-immigration in the right form. So it's the right type of immigration. Are we filling skills gaps that we don't currently have? But again, the proviso being, and I hear it all the time, that's all very well and good, importing labour. But what we don't want to do is do what we did when we were in the EU, which was allow businesses to get away with not supporting staff, putting the right skills plans in place and just relying on more forms of cheap labour. But if there's a clear plan where there are immediate gaps that are then backed up by better education policies to be able to train local people to be able to fill those jobs, then that's something that other countries do particularly well. We for whatever reason, just try and leave it to the market a little bit too much. I think there is a big problem around some of the definitions of legal migration as well, issues over student visas that need to be get to grips with, and it's good to see those come down over the last few months, but will they continue? I don't know. But again, we keep coming back to this. It seems to be a bit of a theme of this talk, Mark. The Home Office is one of those departments that absolutely is working against the democratic mandate of the government. I mean, we've seen multiple Home Secretaries who, let's be honest, it's not as if they are doing it because the Prime Minister's asked them to do it and they are the Home Secretary or a Home Office Minister. They fervently believe in trying to deliver lower immigration passionately, and they found it virtually impossible to do it. The system leaks. They try and make political problems for ministers to try and throw off track plans. And ultimately, you do have this spectre of the ECHR, which ultimately we should always apply. I'm one of those that sits in the middle in that I believe we should absolutely be standing by our international commitments unless the government or parliament decide to vary those international commitments. Now, it's an international commitment, right? It is a negotiation. If that can be changed and varied, then absolutely fine. And if you want to withdraw from an international treaty in the appropriate circumstances, that is the democratic right of a sovereign state to be able to do so. But on the basis that we are a party to them, then the biggest blocker to those is the ECHR. And I think people recognize that.
So just want to be clear there, Ben, that you would favour departing. I mean, I've got a lot of sympathy with what you say. I don't think that it's good darts to sign an international treaty and then say we're just going to ignore it. I think you should have the courage of your convictions and say, you know, if our signature's on the bottom of the page, we will abide by it. But we may wish to actually withdraw. We just put up a poll asking people whether they'd like to see that as a Conservative manifesto commitment to formally withdraw rather than to try and snake around it or find ways to wriggle out of it. Why not just have the guts to say, actually, this isn't really working in the modern world. Let's pull out.
I think this follows on from one of the fundamental reasons that I voted for Brexit, which is I'm a strong believer that the UK as a sovereign state should be sovereign over the decisions that it takes. And the ultimate people who they're responsible to are the public that voted for them. Now, if you get into this weird place where we were in the EU, and we still are to some extent with the ECHR, which is you stand on a mandate of lowering immigration, but a third party from elsewhere in the world that you've signed up to says that you can't do that, then I personally think that the thing that should reign supreme is the mandate that you've been given by the public. And if that mandate is to deliver lower immigration, and we will hopefully see some stronger this explained in very strong terms, hopefully in the coming days by the Prime Minister, because I do think that can move the dial, then I think the Prime Minister should absolutely be prepared and should come out and say that if it's going to lower immigration and it's going to meet our manifesto commitments of lowering immigration to whatever he sets the standard, and that means we have to leave the ECHR, then absolutely we should be prepared to leave the ECHR. Because otherwise you have a non-democratic body who is overruling the democratic mandate of the people who will be electing the next government. And that for me is just seems nonsensical. You are not a sovereign state in that sense. And then, and sorry to go on, Mark, but then you also get those on the left and those particularly pro-Europeans who kind of say, oh yeah, but you know, what you're saying is any trade deal you would ever possibly sign is giving up sovereignty. It's like, well, no, because that's voluntarily entered into.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is we are voluntarily entering into the current state, but the next government might decide that actually it wants to renegotiate that or end those terms. There's nothing wrong with that.
So just a bit of feedback on the polls on scrapping the OBR, wanting that to be a Conservative manifesto commitment. 68% say yes, 18% say no, 14% say don't know. And a commitment to leave the ECHR, wanting that to be in the Conservative manifesto. 87% say they'd like to see that as a manifesto commitment, 9% disagree, and 4% don't know. I guess the immigration discussion, Ben, touches on another political party that might have implications for the Conservatives. This is particularly the pitch of the Reform Party, right? So a good number of people in the chat have said, you know, what do you think we could possibly do to win back voters from Reform? I think I'm right in saying that the Reform UK didn't run against you in Tees Valley, but they endorsed some Social Democrat candidate or something. Have I got that right? You can explain the details there. But if the polls are to be believed, even if they are narrowing, there's still, I don't know, 10, 12% who are saying that they would plump for Reform UK. And Reform UK seem to be almost, I think Nigel Farage has said this earlier, positioning themselves as the sort of true Conservatives. How would you deal with that?
So just to pick you up on that point, Mark, so I never had a Reform candidate stand against me. They just didn't select one. And actually, I got the support of all of the local Reform general election candidates. So maybe that was a reason they didn't stand. What's happened actually is in Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland, in Simon Clarke's constituency, Reform are saying they're not standing a candidate, but Rod Liddle is standing for the SDP. So there's something strange going on over there. I mean, when it comes to Reform, I've always believed to some extent you cannot worry about other organizations and other parties. It's a bit like anything in life. You can worry about other people's business, but you can only control what is within your gift to control. And you know, I think reform's a little bit of what happened with UKIP, in that there was a push to try and placate UKIP in the early 2010s, 2011, 2013, obviously culminated in 2014 in the European elections, where they did incredibly well. And the Conservative Party, to some extent, were too distracted by what was going on with UKIP. It didn't flesh out its own prospect and have confidence in its own prospectus that it should do. And I believe the same with Reform. I mean, Reform absolutely have the right to stand. They have the absolute right to say what they want to say, rather than us trying to placate or somehow kind of adopt that or somehow kind of bring them into the fold and all this kind of, do we do pacts and all that kind of stuff. I think the whole thing's nonsense. I think the Conservative Party, I think the Reform is a symptom of an issue with the Conservative Party. And if the Conservative Party went back to its traditional roots and had a strong policy that it came out with in the manifesto and was able to demonstrate actually over a period of years that we had strong views on not just immigration, but we had strong views on left behind areas, left behind towns, communities that have felt like they're neglected. It goes to the whole levelling up agenda. Then I think you would find, a bit like with UKIP, when we got to grips with it, it would all dissipate. And it did dissipate once we actually got our act together. For whatever reason, we had the Brexit referendum, Theresa May, and then Boris comes in. That all disappeared. And we've created Reform because we've not got to grips with the challenges of the country, and we've not got to grips with what the people want. And hopefully, like I say, I'm hopeful and optimistic that Rishi will come out with something over the coming days that tries to address that, because he's going to absolutely have to do that if he wants to win the election.
And there's possibly another area. Nick Puntis, who's the Conservative prospective candidate for Chippenham in the general election, he wades in saying Stonewall should be banned from any involvement in the NHS and in education, amongst others. Do you agree? Beverly Stacey follows up by saying all ideology-based charity should be expunged from politics. I guess culture wars, or the war on woke, or whatever you want to call it, it's quite difficult to nail down and say precisely what it is. But my sort of general feeling is a number of traditional Conservatives feel that we've metaphorically taken the knee a bit more than we probably should have done. And there needs to be more of a standing up for kind of common sense and free speech, and rather less pussyfooting around on, what we can actually say and do, and allowing this sort of, incredibly woke, often supremely controversial bodies to infiltrate the NHS and schools potentially.
I mean, I think what most people want across the country is common sense. And I think most people push back against the extremes on wokery and all of the stuff that you've just mentioned, Mark. And I think it's frustrating that we haven't seen our elected politicians, particularly in government, stand up for more of that. What I think demonstrates that to be true, not just from when I speak to people out and about and with friends and family and people in the community, is that you can see that the quote unquote war on woke is to some extent starting to recede. It's not gone anywhere, but you can see that, even with the likes of Keir Starmer now pretending he knows what a woman is, albeit I'm sure he'll flip-flop on that if he gets elected as Prime Minister, we're starting to see other organisations excluding, for example, trans men from being able to compete in women's sports. You are starting to see a pushback. And I think that's only possible because the way that these kind of organizations and bodies work, they're always petrified for being blamed. It goes back to this blame culture and responsibility. And I think we're starting to see that recede ever so slightly because people feeling more confident that either in whispers or more out loud, people are now starting to disagree with the idea that we should be as inclusive as we currently have become. And I think that will start to recede. But the issue is the war is not won, and we need to continue to make the fight for common sense. And we should absolutely try and accommodate people. We should absolutely be inclusive. There's nothing wrong with being inclusive, but in a commonsensical way, right? I mean, if somebody wants to be trans, from my personal point of view, I don't care, right? Let them identify and live however they want to live, as long as that doesn't impinge on my rights or anybody else's rights to be able to live the life in which they see fit as well. And that therefore shouldn't impinge on public policy that should be there for all, that creates perverse outcomes. So it's not to say that those people don't have genuine feelings in the way that they want to be and live their life. But I do think people feel that the line has been crossed and that there needs to be a rebalance of common sense, which, like I say, I'm quite optimistic. I think we're starting to see aspects of that balance be readdressed. In other areas, not so much. But again, it's going to require people to get to grips with it. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see. hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the danger that you can be so open-minded you can't keep anything in. I think that's the criticism of extreme liberalism, right? You're so open-minded you can't keep anything in. But another interesting one. This is from David Noblet about the sort of basic tagline of the sort of campaign we should run. Forget labels. Let's think policies: a secure border, smaller government, lower tax burden, balanced books, individual freedom, zero tolerance of crime. How about that on the front cover of the Conservative Manifesto when it launches?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one thing that we've not touched upon yet that I think will go down incredibly well across the country, irrespective of people's political persuasion or background, whether you're from London or whether you're from Middlesbrough or Bolton or anywhere in between, we've got to be much, much tougher on crime. I mean, I just think the British public have always been much more to the right on social issues like crime than anyone in the media or anyone in the commentary or in the Westminster bubble ever are. And we're starting to see that. I think some of the perverse decisions that you're starting to see from police forces across the country, the enforcement of existing laws, that would go a long way. But then you've also got the credibility issue. It's one thing to promise something. People have got to see it as being credible, and then you've got to deliver on it. But I was speaking to Michael Heseltine, this was about over a year ago now, and I asked him, I've got to know him a little bit on some projects we're doing in the area. And I asked him, I think I knew the answer to this, but I asked him, I said, Michael, you've been around politics for decades now, long, long time, long before I was even a glint in my father's eye. Are there ideas that are being brought up now that are novel, that you find interesting? And he was adamant. He said, there is nothing new in politics. It's all circular. There are no new ideas. It's how you implement those ideas and which one you think ultimately are the right ideas to implement. And that's the problem we've got. And one of the things that I just believe is cast iron true is people want people to be extremely tough on criminality. They want to feel safe. They want their high streets to feel safe. They want their family to feel safe. And they want those people who break the law to be held to account to the nth degree. And what this comes back to, and I think this really goes to the heart of things, I think it goes to the heart of everything, particularly in social policy, and in particularly in immigration, which I think links extremely well with criminality, not because those two are linked, but I think it just comes back to a point of fairness. People, if I've been wronged and somebody has broken the law, say somebody's attacked me, I will feel wronged, and I think it will be unfair if the person that attacked me was not held to account for their actions in a sensible fashion. And in the same way, it goes to the point of immigration. People aren't against immigration, but they just don't see immigration as fair because they see, rightly or wrongly, subjectively or objectively, a level of immigration into this country which is inhibiting their own prospects and their community's prospects. They look towards their children and they say, well, hang on, if we're bringing all of these immigrants in from anywhere across the world, doesn't really matter where, they're going to get opportunities that really should be going to communities in my area that have been left behind for a long, long time. It goes to a point of fairness. It's not a point of xenophobia. It's not a point of people wanting to hang everybody that's, murdered anybody. It's not about capital punishment. It's about a sense of fairness. And I think in some of our social policy, I think the majority of the public, the silent majority, feel that there has been a loss of that fairness within the system.
Ben, we've only got a couple of minutes to go, but thinking we obviously don't know the outcome of the election yet, but there's an interesting question from Corbyn here. Should the Tory party be a centrist party, a centre to centre right party, or a right-wing political party? Do you think in those terms about where we position ourselves clearly and unambiguously? Do you think the Conservative Party, certainly at a parliamentary level, you sit in the House of Lords, obviously, but in the House of Commons, doesn't seem to be wholly reflective of the Conservative Party membership, let alone Conservative Party voters? Do you think the Conservative Party needs to be a bit prouder about its name actually being Conservative, unambiguously so?
I think we should absolutely be more confident and proud of being Conservative. And you often find as a result, because again, you get into this Westminster bubble, and I've seen it, thankfully, largely from the outside. You get a lot of good people going into politics. They become candidates. They, hopefully, touchwood, get elected to be good MPs. But it's very difficult when you're in an environment where there is that kind of groupthink. And over time, it can have an erosion in a view on how you see the world, right? Because you interact with the world in which you receive it. And if you're in London 4 or 5 days a week and you're listening to what is a very, very minute section of society that have a very particular and strong view on the world, it can easily distort what you think the rest of the country thinks. It also goes to the point, Mark, of what you define as centrist or right wing. I mean, I would consider myself to be a relative centrist, but I absolutely believe in strong borders. I believe in strong sentencing. I believe in zero tolerance policing. I mean, all of the things that I think, and I speak to Conservative members up and down the country all the time, there's nothing that they say that I can ever really disagree with, but I kind of see that as well. That's just right of centre conservatism.
Mhm.
Whereas if you were to speak to maybe someone at the BBC or probably somebody in the Labour Party, they would say that that view was actually, you know, alt-right and extremist. And that's the problem. It's the definition of what you consider those things to be, not actually where you sit on the spectrum. And what you also find is the spectrum moves with the Venn diagram, depending on what's happened in politics over the preceding number of years. And I think we're definitely in a cycle that has been propagated actually because of what happened and the decisions that were taken during things like COVID and the amount of public spending and the fact that we became a very paternalistic government and society during that period and actually post-period as well, that it has moved the Venn diagram much further left than it was, say, 5 or 6 years ago. And so you're always dealing with the moving picture, which is the zeitgeist of the public at the time, because the public don't sit static either. The mood of the public shifts to the left and it shifts to the right, but it's always within a small degree. The public never swings to communism, right? It's never really going to vote for a Corbyn, actually, and it's never going to vote for, you know, the National Front at the other end. It's always, you know, around the edges, but the world is lived in the grey, and it's always, you know, it's always lived between, as we've seen with election results, between New Labour, Tony Blair kind of politics, which is more, again, right of centre economically, probably left of centre socially. Sorry, apologies, the other way around. Kind of right of centre socially, left of centre, I think, marginally on economics, through to the same on the right. And you see Tony Blair get elected, you see David Cameron get elected, you actually see Boris Johnson get elected. You know, socially, in some ways, actually really conservative, in other ways, very not conservative, but economically left of centre, but left of centre rather than left wing. And I think that's where the British public, certainly for the last 40 or 50 years, have been in and around that area.
Just to the one final question for you, but the result on should we commit to repealing the Equality Act in our manifesto, 74% say yes, 13% say no, 13% say don't know. Very lastly, Ben, given especially going back to the top of the show and your success in Tees Valley, and you know, 3 wins in a row for the Conservatives there is an epic achievement. Do you think the party needs to connect rather better with its grassroots? I think with what we got a week to go, we've still got 150 or 160 Conservative candidates to be selected. We've had a whole range of seats, which one would imagine have a very good chance of ending up in the Conservative column, that have been vacant a candidate for months and are now going to have a small cabal at Conservative Central Office effectively deciding who the candidate is, putting 3 candidates forward. I mean, surely, if you want to boost the Conservative Party membership, and if we believe that, you know, the people should decide, we need a great deal more power given over to local associations and considerably less given to Conservative Central Office, no?
I mean, I joined the Conservatives as a member a long time ago now, and I think the party is based on its membership. I mean, I can't do my job as mayor, and I wouldn't have been re-elected if it wasn't for the members that came out and campaigned for me and supported me and helped me raise funds, help the local MPs, those out on the doorstep right now. I mean, and what you often find is when people become MPs and elected officials, they lose sight of the fact that actually they're responsible to the membership and all of a sudden think they're responsible to the leadership or they're responsible to the government because, you know, they have aspirations. And I think it's sometimes human nature to continue to want to progress personally. And that's why people kind of point in that direction. But I've always tried, and it's one of the reasons we've always had so much success. And it's one of the reasons we've always had so much ground support and grassroots support out on the doorstep, is I would not be sat here today if it wasn't for our grassroots. And I think lots of MPs, past and present, would do well to remember that.
And we should perhaps give them a little bit more influence then in making some decisions, right? Rather than just relying on to leaflet and knock on doors.
Yeah, I mean, I found it really interesting. This is many years ago now, and I left it, so I don't know where this is. I think there is still some form of it. But one of the first things I did when I got involved in politics, obviously I got involved just before the 2010 election, 2009, ended up delivering leaflets, just wanted to help out. And when I kind of got involved in the association and kind of said, well, what's the Conservative Party about? One of the things that really drew me to it was the Conservative Policy Forum, which I thought was a really interesting concept. I don't think we've got it quite right, but the principle's right in that there is if you are planning these things properly, there is a longer term engagement with the membership who are actually quite representative of the public and much more representative, like you say, of maybe the MPs and people like myself, that can then inform a manifesto, whether it's a snap election or whether it's going to be in 2 or 3 years' time, it doesn't matter. The legwork has been done. And I remember one of the first things that we were consulted on, and it was only, and again, there are ways it could be made much better because it was more of a consultation on rather than us driving it in the way that people might want to, was the Bill of Rights. And that was back in 2011, right? And we've been talking about a commitment of a Bill of Rights, and it's knocked on and knocked on and knocked on. And there could be some interesting work you could do to strengthen the membership role in manifesto creation. But I also think at the same time, you can't lose sight of the fact that over the last couple of years, things have been tough. But if you take the lifespan of the Conservative Party, and the systems we have do change, but are not completely different or vastly different from those that we've always had, it has largely stood us in good stead. You know, we are the most successful party in politics in the world electorally because we have a system that does seem to work. Now, does that mean that it can change and it can evolve? Of course it can. But, you know, kind of radical reform where you go to what the Lib Dems do or you do what the Labour Party does on adoption of policy, I wouldn't necessarily I think that's going too far, right? But again, there's got to be a measure of involvement with the party and members in particular, because I think where you go through tough times, the membership become disaffected, and that's the point in which you want to bring them into the fold even more. And there has got to be a mechanism to do that. And I think the party are trying to find a way. They've just not found a way that strikes that balance as well as it could be.
Ben, 3 cheers for that. We've overrun our time, but an absolutely fascinating discussion. I should say to all of you on the call, our next pop conversation, it's number 6, is with the legendary economist Dr. Art Laffer, who will be joining us from the United States of America on Tuesday the 11th at 7 p.m. UK time. If you go to the chat, you can find out where you can register for that. Just click on the link and make sure you join us then. I appreciate that a lot of you will be out on your doorsteps, but if you want to hear from one of the most articulate, imaginative and charismatic economists of our age, spare an hour for Art Laffer in conversation with me on the 11th of June at 7 p.m. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Good luck on how you spend the rest of the campaign. But my particular thanks to the great Lord Houchen. Congratulations again on your recent re-election, Ben. I know you'll be very busy helping Conservatives between now and July the 4th. And thanks so much for giving up more than an hour of your time to cover such a wide expanse of policy and politics in discussion. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. Thanks so much.
No, thank you, Mark. It's been really interesting.
So do join us for Art Laffer on June the 11th. If you haven't already signed up for our newsletter, go to popularconservatism.com. Please send the link to your friends and others in the party and beyond. We won't spam you. You'll only get a Friday newsletter from us to keep you abreast of our thinking. Good luck out there between now and July the 4th. Thanks again for joining us. Have a terrific evening. Over and out.